both traditional and academics and scholars, medicine women and men, just so many people coming from we really felt that we needed to center sovereignty, because sovereignty is the right that we fight for. So I will go ahead and introduce our panel, and then I will go ahead and distinguished guests for today. Sovereignty is inherent to indigenous peoples and nations, in our systems and practices, there are thousands of years. It arises from indigenous peoples, cultures, societies, cosmovisions, and connections to our land, and connections to our lands and our territories. Sovereignty means different things. Sovereignty means different things around the world because of the multiplicity of indigenous nations and therefore lifeways. However, the core qualities of sovereignty, different expressions are rooted in autonomy, self-determination, our ability to have nation-to-nation relationships, our distinct cultures, and the ceremonies and lifeways that emerge from that distinct and our distinct and special relationships to our lands, territories, and waters. Sovereignty of indigenous peoples has been under attack, and oppressed by and Western-based colonization, and the imposition of settler colonial and other systems of governance, economies, religions, and technologies that have tried to suppress ours. Additionally, we have endured theft of our lands and forced displacement because of the thefts of our lands and at the most extreme, genocides of our people, deep violence that we have experienced as peoples. However, indigenous peoples have always found ways to resist and to protect our relationships to our food, to our water, our lands, our territories, our languages, plants, animals, our spiritual practices, and we have done this. And we have done with tremendous sacrifice, died so that we can have these rights. This session will focus on three components: land, law, and peoples, and how this is implemented around the world, whether it is an inherent right of indigenous nations, and as part of development and international human rights law, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now I will present the speakers. It is my great honor and privilege to present Mr. Robert Tim Coulter, who is the Executive Director of the Indian Law Resource Center, a mentor, and somebody that I have known for many years as well, and I have been privileged to learn from. Tim is an attorney who practices in the fields of Indian law and international human rights law. He is the founder and executive director of the Indian Law Resource Center of the Indian Law Resource Center in Montana, Washington. The center provides legal assistance for indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, as we also know it as ABIA. He is a member of the Potawatomi Nation and a justice of the Supreme Court of the Citizen with more than 45 years of legal experience in the field of Indian affairs and human rights. He has published numerous articles in these and other fields of law. Before starting the center in 1978, he was acting executive director of the Institute for the Development of Indian Law, for the development of staff attorney for the Native American Legal Defense and Education, and the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He was awarded the Lawrence A. Wayne Prize for Social Responsibility by Columbia University Law School in 2001, and the Bicentennial Medal by Williams College in 2002. Welcome. Next, we welcome Dr. Laura George. Laura George is governance and rights of the Marin Peoples Association. the APA, which is an advocacy group for the rights of indigenous peoples in Guyana, and works in Guyana to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are represented in areas of project, legislation, and policy development. Laura is an indigenous woman. Laura is an indigenous and a proud member of the Kapo also known as the Forested Highlands in Guyana. Forested Highlands in Guyana, and I apologize for the mispronunciation. Laura was invited by her leaders to provide translation services in Guyana's High Court for the Guyana's High Court for the in a landmark litigation case for over 23 years and are still awaiting a decision. Laura has fiercely represented the rights of indigenous peoples both within and out of Guyana, having witnessed the destruction of the waterways and forests by mining. She follows in the footsteps of her elders who created the path for advocacy and rights representation in her home. The American Indian Peoples Association, or the APA, gives her the public platform and voice to be a rights advocate. Welcome. And last, we invite Dr. Kyle White, Professor of Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan. Kyle is George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Previously, he was Professor of Philosophy and Community Sustainability and Tim Nick Chair at Michigan State University. Kyle's research addresses moral issues concerning climate policy, indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of indigenous justice in public and academic discussion, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. He too is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Kyle has partnered with numerous tribes, First Nations, and other indigenous organizations and the Great Lakes regions and beyond on climate change and policy. He is involved in projects and organizations that advance indigenous research, methodologies, including the Climate and Traditional Knowledge Sustainable Development Institute of the College of Menominee Nation, the affiliated tribes of Indians Climate Change Program, and Napayote Maramatanga. He has served as an author on reports by the U.S. Program, and is former member of the U.S. Federal Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science and the Michigan Environmental Justice. So welcome to all of the distinguished panelists. We will start with the roundtable discussion. Our first question will allow each panelist to have 5 minutes to respond, which will set the context and help us open a broader conversation on sovereignty. So the first question for all panelists, how do you understand indigenous sovereignty as it relates to your work, and or to your nation, and how does your nation exercise this and we will start with Mr. Tim Coulter.
In my own work, I find that the term sovereignty very often because I find that the listeners usually don't have a very clear understanding at all. Term actually means the term we hear a lot, and the term we know it must be something good. It must be something good. But I tried to find ways talk about whatever it is sovereignty that I'm really trying to get at. It can be the right sometimes to govern something, the right to control something. Other times it means the right to be free from part of an outside government, or the right to do things something such as culture. Sometimes today we hear about food sovereignty. I would take to me effort to gain control over food resources, to avoid the problems that come from lack. Well, while I recommend that, what works for me doesn't necessarily work for others. But I think it's true that the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous doesn't use the term because it deals in a lot of details. As you probably already know. Endless details. I think it's fair to say that the term sovereignty means power to govern something, unity, for example, or a nation, to govern or control an area of particular resources, to be free from external interference. It's generally an inherent right. It's something you said, meaning it's something granted normally by another government. But it could be granted by another government. Sometimes it arises by force of law. For example, if one government discovers a completely unknown land, international law would accord sovereignty to that discovering nation if full occupation and other requirements were met. So sovereignty can arise in certain funny ways. It doesn't usually. It's usually inherent. By the way, almost never absolute. You shouldn't make the mistake. And never be limited. Sovereignty can be limited sometimes by international law. Force of facts. Well, maybe that's enough. In my world, that's how we would use it. How my nation uses it. I'm not a very good authority about that. They certainly do a lot of things. In the way of developing resources of the nation.
Thank you so much. Now we will go to Laura.
Okay, thank you. Let me say Miara first. Said hello. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be here. And yes, so I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting the APA. Thank you for inviting the panel discussion to this. So what is how as indigenous peoples in Guyana or as the Kapong Nation? How do we understand our sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty? I believe that the mere fact our nation has sought litigation in court really was to establish we have the right to our lands and we need this to be protected. We need our right to our lands and the use of our lands and the ownership of our lands to be respected. So in that sense, what does it mean? It means that we are calling on the state to respect our right to decision making on our lands and our territories, on our lands and our waters and the ownership of our waters and the ownership and the protection of our lands and territories. So that is what we would understand to be
Laura, your bandwidth seems to be coming and going. Yes, coming and going. I was going to suggest that. Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. Yes, one of my colleagues was suggesting that one of my colleagues was suggesting that probably I can connect directly. I'm not sure what I can do now. He's not in the office. What I can do now when he's not in the office. Yes. So as I was saying that. Yes. So as I was saying that. As Indigenous peoples, we live in territories here in Guyana. So whether it's here in Guyana, so whether it's my nation, which is the Akawais, or the Kapong, whether it's the southern part of Guyana, who are the southern part of Guyana, who are the Wapichan, we occupy territories. We occupy territories. So our sovereignty would be. So our sovereignty would be our way of life, and our way of life, decision making as decision makers within territories. Peoples within territories to decide how we use and occupy our lands, and to call for the state to respect our right to decision making, our right to decision making, our right to be included decision making on decision making policies, national policies, legislative development or legislative development or legislative project implementation and all of that, because whatever and all of that, decisions are made impact our way of life, and therefore our right, to say yes or no, to say right, yes or no, to our right informed consent. That is our way of, that is our way of our right, respect our right to self-determination, our right to self-determination. It is our sovereignty, right, and it is our sovereignty, make decisions on our lands, make decisions on our lands. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Finish with Kyle. And now we'll finish with Kyle.
Good to have a chance to connect with everybody and to hear the really important points made by Tim and Laura, which I appreciate. Greatly. Another dimension of sovereignty that is particularly close to my work, has to do with this idea. What does it mean to be sovereign, or to be sovereign situation? A sovereign situation. I recognize that. I recognize places in the world that use that places in the world sovereignty or a cognate sovereignty or a cognate language, and there's other places where there's other places where there's other types of concepts, self-determination. I'll just use sovereignty. I'll just use sovereignty here because it's familiar. But to be sovereign, oftentimes means where we as individuals, have a support that allows us to make good choices about our lives, and to depend on other people, depend on other responsibilities, and also have responsibilities so that they can depend on us. I think there's an important ethical way, an important ethical way to define sovereignty, which is sometimes aligned with different political and legal understandings of sovereignty. Other times it can be at odds. And so I see a lot of work that tribes are doing, including Potawatomi tribes and other Potawatomi tribes people as engaging in some cases about sovereignty, especially in terms of relationships to land. So when tribes invest resources, caretaking activities, cultural recovery activities, and educational and youth support activities, and activities and elders and other knowledge keepers. That's also building sovereignty. That's also building sovereignty. So too in tribes processes where members of the tribe were deeply invested and participated in tribal policy decisions, building that democratic way of life and governance connection to sovereignty. Also a connection. So in terms of the areas I work in, climate change, primarily. I'm constantly witnessing tribes, through this, this conception of sovereignty. I work with a lot of tribes. The Great Lakes region, which is where I'm located. You asked about my own nation. Potawatomi Nation does do a number of things that I do follow. Try to stay connected to. Try to stay connected to sovereignty. For example, sovereignty. The nation has invested in geothermal and other types of renewable energy. And oftentimes the rationale for doing that is to lower housing costs, so to bring the community together, to create more integration. We have a food sovereignty sovereignty garden. We have a food sovereignty garden in Oklahoma, attempting to be tied to the recovery or to the recovery language and building community language and kinship bonds. The tribe invested in its water, infrastructure and resources, which actually has helped sovereignty in cases where a decade ago another county which had a lot of native folks because the drought condition was out of the drought condition was out. Our nation was able to support them by providing water that they could use. So for me these are also acts of sovereignty that are about sovereignty that are about that community network and about that network and about that mutual aid and dependence and responsibility.
Thank you so much to each of you. Thank you so much to each. Now I will go into more specific questions, more specific questions for each, and then I will invite to add any comments or any reflections that they may have, or any reflections that they may have. So I will start in the same order. With Tim. We'll start with Tim. Tim, you have had many decades of human rights work that have really allowed many of us, such as myself, to have recognized rights in a document. And when you and other and you have always had such stories to tell of the process. Why did you and other indigenous leaders start the drafting process for the UN Declaration? And how has this become a turning point in indigenous people's rights? And what progress has been made? And what progress in international human rights law for indigenous peoples? And you will have about 10 minutes to respond. And you are okay.
There.
And you are okay.
There. The situation not actually was very different in the 1960s and 1970s and 1970s. By that I mean to say the situation has improved a great deal in the United States. But I learned early on the law about what the United States government with respect to Indian tribes, At least there are many terrible aspects elements of the law that are really pernicious, unjust and discriminatory. For example, the supposed power of the United States to simply take Indian land or Indian without due process or compensation. That's still the law today. The power of the United States government to just terminate tribes, put them out of existence for legal purposes. The system of involuntary trusteeship, whereby all tribes are said to be in a state of trusteeship, not owning their own property, and subject to the power of the United States. Ironically, most tribes think that's a good status. Thoroughly understood that. In any event, there's some advantages. Point of view of some tribes, but the fact that Indian treaties can be frequently are without any recourse for the tribes involved. Well, that's just another of the problems in federal Indian law, and it proved to be impossible to change any of that going to court by asking judges to overrule those old precedents. It just didn't work. We couldn't get anyone to listen and to tell Congress that what in some situations unconstitutional or a violation of the Bill of Rights. Congress had the idea, still does, that it has the power to practically anything it wants. To Indian tribes without any regard or any of the limitations in the Constitution. And so Indian nations, chiefs, councils, and others felt it would be important to find some other way. They were particularly in cases concerned about land. They were concerned about land claims. They would like land claims. They would like to recover illegally taken. In some cases, they merely wanted. To protect land already in possession of. They wanted to correct. Many of these problems in federal Indian law have a better chance of succeeding as nations and peoples. They already knew about the possibility of going to the United Nations, particularly the Six Nations in New York and Canada knew about it because a Cayuga chief went to the League of Nations in the 1920s and attempted to speak there and not allowed to do it, made a great impression on other Indian peoples for his efforts to do it. That was Desgaje. He still remembered. In fact, a number of other Indian leaders in the 1950s. There wasn't any action. That resulted from it. What we found was that there was an opportunity to the United Nations, or at least non-governmental organizations working about the need for change. And so we did that. In 1977 in the United Nations building. Although it wasn't a formal UN conference. When we went there, with a draft declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. I had learned in order to create or develop international you have to start somewhere, and the starting point with a declaration, a non-binding declaration. And so that was our starting point. We also understood that international law wasn't really well developed. Didn't have many of the things we needed. For example, in international law, human rights recognized rights for individuals, not for communities. Community or collective rights didn't really exist except in the case of self-determination. And the law of self-determination to peoples like indigenous peoples inside. There was nothing in international human rights law about environment. There was nothing about recognizing. There was nothing about and so on. So we knew we had a lot of that needed to be done. That needed to be done. I may be getting near my 10 minutes would remind me when I'm over my time,
You're doing just fine. Just fine.
All right. So we started an effort to get a declaration adopted in the United Nations. It was slow work. It was 30 years. It took 30 years. But eventually we were able to do it. What was interesting about the process was that as the process moved forward, we're educating countries all over the world. And although we started working just with the Americans in 1977, expanded almost immediately to the whole world. We began educating countries that thought they never had any indigenous peoples, and they started to learn about these rights, claiming rights that we were explaining to them. And they actually began to respect those rights and to try to before the declaration was a process of developing new legal standards. Is a fluid one, and it is carried on is carried on practice and in practical matter, as a practical matter. That's where we are today. That's where we are today with the Declaration and in the UN Organization of States. Its version called the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous. As these rights are put into practice by countries and are used and recognized, and slowly these rights become customary international law is binding, and that is binding. International law, once it is crystallized, as they say, is binding. International law, and we're in the process of seeing these rights become a part of customary international law. Well, of course, there's much more that could be said. That was the gist of it. Why we turned to the United Nations. We were really interested in changing things, changing domestic law, the massacres, the lawlessness that was inflicted around indigenous peoples. That's what we were aiming for. We had to set some standards somewhere. We had to get the moral authority and the rules. So that was what we were trying to do. It's a long road. It's a long road now, still to go, as you know.
Thank you so much. Really gives so much to think about, and so much to think about how you started. You said how not much has changed. You said not much has changed. Much has even supposedly changed. Our time supposedly changed. Our time, but yet we still continue fighting. But yet we still continue fighting for our right to exist as people. Our right to exist as people. And so, at this time, I'd like to invite Laura, Kyle, or Laura. Add any additional comments on the question on the UN Declaration. Really how this really is a turning point for Indigenous people's rights, and stick to your comments or reflections for like one or two. Kyle or Laura. So Kyle or Laura.
I'm happy to share a few thoughts. I appreciate what history, the current practice, the history, the current practice, the critical morals and justice anti-violence rationales of the movement, establish human rights for collective people, groups like Indigenous. One thing I note in my work in the United States, one of these nations that has a lot of legal machinery for recognizing the sovereignty of tribes, but it's also a very deeply problematic system, one that has a lot of flaws, also a lot of artifice to it, defining for Indigenous people what political sovereignty means. So I've been inspired, and I've been inspired a lot of Native American folks, Native American federally recognized tribes, using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, using international norms regarding consent, as ways to suggest stronger standards that should be implemented in the U.S. system. And so that's been encouraging to see that. For grassroots the UN Declaration.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. If you would like to add in. Laura, the floor is yours. You
guys cannot hear me?
Now we can. Thank you.
Hello?
Now we can. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, now your audio is coming through. Laura, can you try your audio again?
Yes, I am speaking. Can you hear me now? I am speaking. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
So I was saying that. The declaration has come in as a very document and tool towards our process of revising, for example, legislation in Guyana for Indigenous peoples. It's called the Amrini Act of 2006. And so in our recommendations and the work that we have been doing together with the body that's called the National Tushals Council, is a body of all elected leaders, Indigenous leaders in Guyana. We have been working to get information and recommendations for what goes into a revised specific legislation. So many communities throughout Guyana have reincorporated the UN DRIP. We incorporate the UN DRIP. What will be a strong legislation, an effective legislation once it gets revised. Our setback, I might say, is that governments of the day have not working very effectively to make sure that the revision takes place. We have a new administration in place in Guyana, and even though that we have been saying this is priority for us, it's still to really to be recognized as priority, and this aspect of work by the administration. But that's how very important it is to us.
Thank you. And as I think we've all been in agreement that the UN Declaration really sets the minimum standards for minimum revisions and realignment, national policy. So it just lots to think about. Now we go to the second question, which is Laura. And in this case, the question is, October of this year will mark 23 years of the landmark legal battle your people have been leading in defense of your traditional territory. Can you share what a ruling for your nation would mean for your permanent lands and territories, including your collective rights and your relationship, and you will have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So it really happened that I was a member of village council. I was in my early 20s. And sitting with our leaders, as a collective and understanding that we had reached a point where our only option at that time was now to take our matter to court. Because our various seeking remedies and calling for respect of our lands. Mining had been, it was entering our lands so much at that point. There were a lot of environmental destruction, other injustices, social injustices, and a lack of respect for Indigenous people's decision making. Those were not being listened to or adhered and respected at all. In the end, we were asked to demonstrate and illustrate what we want all of these lands for, and what do we want to do with it, or how do we use our lands. In the eyes of the political administration at that time, this is just too much of land for us. We are two peoples in that area. We call the Ariconas and the Kapong, the Akawayos, and the rampant destruction that was happening, and the government's lack of respect to protect our lands and respecting our voices really led and forced us to take this matter to court. And yes, so 23 years we have been we have been, right now we're waiting a decision. Right now we're waiting a decision. For a date, even if a date to be announced. Even if a date to be announced. For a decision to be heard. For a decision to be made. A decision to be made. Only very recently, our leaders, there are 8 villages that you call there are 8 villages that you call 8 villages but at the time it was 6 villages that took this matter to court. Out of from between that time to now, out of the 6 plaintiffs, who are our indigenous leaders at the time, 2 of those plaintiffs have passed on. And many of our elder witnesses who testified in the court, that I said earlier in the introduction that I was able to translate in our language, for the purposes of the judge and the lawyers to understand. Many of our elders have also passed on. When our leaders, our communities took a collective decision to take this to court, we understood that it would take 15, 20, even 30 years before we can see any decision. And this is what I recall, as I said. I was a young woman, and then along with my elders, when we understood that taking this route, we were not going to see a resolution very easily and very quickly. But taking that decision at time also meant that we were as peoples, as the Pemong and the Kapong, taking that decision to ensure that our lands are protected for our future generations. And even with our witnesses, our elder witnesses testifying how we use our lands, how we protect our lands, how we protect our knowledge, our traditional knowledge, and indigenous knowledge have contributed to protecting our lands by way of our way of life. It has been challenged so much by the state that we actually do not have lands. These are state lands. And that only those that are granted by the state and that are which were granted in 1991 to us fragmented within a territory, and it does not provide protection for us as a collective within the territory. So much of our farming grounds, hunting lands, fishing areas, our sacred lands, lie beyond the boundaries of these tidal lands. And it's coming more and more urgent that the court makes a decision. Our elders, our leaders who came recently to Georgetown to have a press conference really was to raise this concern and the urgency for a decision to be made. The last presentations and documents that we submitted was in 2017. And since then to now, we have not had any being announced on when a decision So what does it mean for us if a decision is made with regards to our people's we spoke about sovereignty earlier. What does it mean? It means that as indigenous peoples within our territory, we will have full control and to exercise our right to say what can happen on our lands, whether it's should we do mining, really it's about self-determination. If we are to be engaged in some mining, how might we be able to protect our lands, apply our own best practices, and also include and apply probably the state legislation, probably the and the regulations of best practice, and the regulations. But really, so because we do not have, because we do not have. So yes, you would see that the map there is the boundary of the land litigation, the area, the land litigation, the area under litigation. And as you see, so I come from Pibili-Pai, so I come from Pibili-Pai that you see there, and our people, we are all one occupying these lands and recognize these lands and recognize these lands time immemorial. So it's not a time immemorial. So it's not a question of what do we do and what do we need all these lands for. What do we need all these lands for? It's that is just really part of our lands. That is just really part of our occupy and use, and we occupy and use, and we know and we own and control as indigenous peoples. As indigenous peoples. The state though having laws that do not recognize us to our rights to lands and our rights to lands and our resources is because they only recognize our lands as granted by the state as an individual village title, as you see for individual for Jawala, individual for Kako, or individual for Waramadang, for Kamarang and for Parima. But there are rivers that run through these villages that we occupy and use, that we occupy and use, that we know to be our lands and waters, that we are fighting for protection. We are fighting for protection of our lands and protection of our lands, and our lands and protection of our lands, and us being able to control what happens on those lands. I don't have a map here that shows you how these covered by mining concessions, covered by mining that have been granted on those lands, that have been granted on those lands without any consultation with us on our lands, without any consent from us. Consent from us, the right to free prior and informed consent. That is not being respected when it comes to our interaction and our interaction of our land rights and recognition of our land rights. That is not happening here. And our way of life is that we live in, you know, we protect our lands, we protect our resources, we protect our resources, our sacred grounds, we respect our sacred grounds. But the state's refusal to respect our rights is taken away from us, exercising and fully controlling what happens on our lands. In our headwaters, we have mining concessions that have mining concessions that have headwaters. And we have been fighting against mining taking place on those lands. We currently have a situation where a leader of Kako village, Tushaw Mario Hastings, who was almost imprisoned for their refusal to allow mining to take place on their waters. We have the situation of Jawala where there are mining permits, and with miners that are coming onto the lands where they fish. Even though the village is trying to say to the mining agency in Guyana, this is our land. They have been told already, even by the relevant ministry, that these lands do not lie within your title. You have no say over what happens. It looks very contiguous there, but there are lands that are occupied by mining. In Pibili-Pai, in my village, we have mining concessions. Along the river, we have mining concessions. We have mining close to the boundary, which are our sacred lands. Because the Roraima area is where we have our systems that say this is where we live, up in the mountains, and that's why we call it mountains, and that's why we call it people from up high. It's people from in the mountains, right? In the mountains, right? That's how we recognize ourselves. That's how we recognize ourselves. So it's really we have reached a point where we're really desperate. We have the COVID-19 pandemic that is taking place. The government is making decisions. The government is making at a national level. At a national level, the inclusion of indigenous peoples and our leaders, what happens, and saying so mining is still very much listed as an essential area of work. And indigenous peoples have not been included to say how might this take place, or to listen to us where we're saying, this is what's happening. This is what's happening. This global warming. Our villages were recently inundated with floods, covered homes that destroyed farms. But in the meantime, there is still, mining concessions that are legally recognized by the state on. This is just by the state on this small area, but it's like that throughout Guyana. But it's like that throughout Guyana.
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
Yes. So yes. So our leaders have recently called for a quick and urgent decision on our land. An urgent decision on our land. Sorry, in the court matter. And we are prepared to. And we are prepared to go to the court of appeal. To go to the court of appeal. To go to the Caribbean Court of Justice, which is the highest court for us here in Guyana. And our young people, our leaders are prepared. Our leaders are prepared. No matter how long it takes, because it is important that we gain control and a right to make decisions on our lands.
Thank you so much for discussing the legal battle that your people had in defense of your lands and territories, critical need to have a decision. I invite Tim or Kyle provide any additional comments that you may have on the battles for really recognition of indigenous lands. I think what we heard is a situation that is affecting indigenous peoples around the world and our fight for our lands. So if we could start with you would have 1 or 2 minutes to offer reflections on this question. And you need to unmute.
The thing that sticks in my mind is the problem subsurface resources. The indigenous people's right to subsurface was not explicitly dealt with. Declaration. We were working on it. The process ended before we could get included in the declaration. But there was a study that during the consideration of the draft declaration, before it was adopted, there was a study. What's called permanent sovereignty over natural resources. Now, ordinarily, permanent sovereignty over natural resources is a part of the right of self-determination. When decolonization occurs, typically has a right of self-determination, and if you want to separate permanent sovereignty over its natural resources. Permanent control over its colonized countries, so the colonized can't continue to or exploit or steal, to be more blunt, the natural resources of the colony. Well, the UN Declaration leaves open the question of subsurface, but the law permanent sovereignty over natural resources, meaning among other things, subsurface is still there in international law. And there's a strong argument that right that can be invoked by indigenous people, the resources under the lands that they own. You might try to find that report not too hard in it. Author of the report was human rights, a member of the human rights at the time named DAES. If you can't find it, get in touch with me. I can help you find it, or I'll send you a copy.
Thank you, and we will have put the link into the chat. Put the link into the chat for the resources. Kyle, would you like to? Kyle, would you like to add some comments as well? Add some comments as well.
That was certainly tough to hear about some of the struggles. Laura described. Continually, the context of the context of Canada, there are so many struggles against there are so many struggles against mining industry, against mining industry, against more broadly extractive industries more broadly. The state of Michigan, for example, we have a pipeline that needs to be repaired. We have a pipeline that needs to be repaired. It's run by Enbridge, and potential reconstructed pipeline greatly affected area that both in terms of Anishinaabe people's origins, but also current practices, and have been part of some of the efforts to decommission the pipeline, change the way that the entire economy understands fossil fuel energy, fossil fuel. But one of the problems is legal and other political deliberations, for Anishinaabe people, for many other Indigenous people, they're not in the position to be able to define what safe enough means to them. They're not in the position to be able to convincingly discuss their own viewscapes and cultural viewscapes and cultural scientists with non-Indigenous scientists, non-Indigenous scientists who would say, well, yeah, the habitats are going to be affected, but they can bounce back again, and they can bounce back again, and they're using a fairly narrow scientific understanding of what a place is valued like in terms of having native plants and animals, having native plants and animals to recover its capacity, a very U.S.-centric way of understanding. I find in this work, and that's just one example, it's still not possible for Indigenous people to articulate their own cultural conceptions of value, of safety, in ways that are on equal footing, or just on respectable footing, with regard to those of the dominant nations and societies.
Thank you so much, and I will commend all of you. We're actually doing very well on time. Doing very well on time. So we'll be able to continue a robust conversation. The last question that we have is for Kyle. So I will begin with a quote for the framing. Indigenous peoples' rights in the best way possible, not just for them, but because they are also solutions to many of the world's problems, to many of the world's climate change, to biological diversity. It is in the self-interest of states and even corporations in the medium and long term to protect and listen to these people. Will they realize this? Will they realize? And this was stated by former special rapporteur of Indigenous peoples, back in 2017, right before the UNF, and bring this in light to the IPCC report that just came out. It's about 4,000 page document. And it references Indigenous 27 times, several times in footnotes, and the couple of times that I saw, whether or not Indigenous people's knowledge is being integrated enough into these systems of methodologies and looking at So my question is, how are Indigenous peoples expressing or trying to express their sovereignty and collective responsibility as it relates to climate change, the global crisis that we're in? And you have 10 minutes.
Thanks for your question, and like a lot of people, it's disturbing to see the recent intergovernmental climate work. I'm actually a contributing author on working group 2. That report's going to come out. It focuses on vulnerability, adaptation issues, and adaptation issues. And I've also serving on the White House Environmental Justice White House Advisory Council, where we're looking climate change and energy infrastructure issues as they relate to issues as they relate to Indigenous people. In my work more broadly, I've really sought to educate folks all the different ways in which Indigenous people's rights and self-determination are connected to climate change. One of the things that struck me when I was starting out in my work is how narrow the dominant understandings of the human-caused climate change was sort of assumed to just something that European or American or other European diasporic societies had discovered, and that maybe had some foundations and foundations of the greenhouse effect, but really gets ramped up in the 60s and 70s. And I thought that in my work and my own understanding of my own communities, that actually something like climate science, human cause, anthropogenic cause, climate change would have been something that folks typically understood. Understood. I mean, Indigenous people, different Indigenous people, maybe not everybody, but a number that I've had the chance learn from different capacities, have ancient stories about what it means encounter climate change, the relationship between environmental change and environmental responsibility. And so I've often said that one of the areas where people exercise sovereignty, and rights in a certain sense, is the right to define what climate change, what it means to our history, and how to properly historicize today's climate change based on different Indigenous tellings of their own history. Another aspect regarding sovereignty and climate change, sovereignty and climate change, is the presumption that the current ordeal of human cause is an unprecedented form, oppressive or unjust or unjust or land set of impacts. And I think there's some important things to note about how different Indigenous people have really pushed back on that assumption. Remember that the fossil industry it wouldn't have been able to take root, massive dispossession of Indigenous people's and so that's one half of it. But remember, if you're one of those people who are so dispossessed, that's also caused infliction of environmental change. If your land base shrinks drastically, if you're forced to relocate hundreds of miles away, if your land base is polluted, if your land bases that changes heavily, changes the soil, changes the temperature, changes the habitats of ecosystems that you have to live with. Most forms of colonial racial capitalism and other racial capitalism and other forms of what they do is inflict very dangerous forms of environmental change and environmental and so today's climate change ordeal is sort of the species of that, and it's not one that's disconnected to that. I've been an author on the National Climate Assessment, which is kind of like the U.S. version, kind of like the U.S. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but it focuses a lot more on adaptation issues, or at least adaptation issues historically. And each time there's been a report, it's demonstrated that Native people in the U.S. context are going to be affected more severely by climate change, increased severity in droughts, increased severe weather events, changes in precipitation patterns, or precipitation patterns, flooding waves, and the irony there, of course, is a horrible irony. Indigenous people have been doubly, triply dispossessed of their land, right? To make for the industries concentrated greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and then again, being disproportionately affected by the results of that after the initial industries took root. And this is what's been particularly troubling for me, and I've seen this in cases all over the world, right here in the U.S. context as well. For a lot of Indigenous folks, when they talk about their traditions, when they talk about their traditions, their economic practices, and sustenance practices, oftentimes those are practices. Oftentimes those are practices small area. There's just a small area of land where you can maintain those practices. Even in cases where you have an economic activity fairly widespread within a tribal community, it's nonetheless not oftentimes a situation where there's like an overabundance or land or ecosystem or habitat to and so just as in the 20th century and currently many indigenous people all over the world are making huge achievements in their rights in their capacities to protect their land. Capacity is simultaneously being curtailed by the effects of climate change on those areas that are valuable for their sustenance and economic traditions. And so the speed of climate change actually threatens to blunt the victories and sovereignty and indigenous rights. And of course that's not Native fault, right? It's fault, right? It's really distressing. It's really distressing how that is occurring. But what's another distressing aspect of climate change tribal sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty has to do with the solutions to climate change. On the one hand, I think we associate extraction, certain types of mining activities, and the use of many solutions to climate change are extractive, either in that same way, either in a way that's fairly analogous, or in a way that's fairly analogous. Solutions to climate change, a lot of solutions to climate change involve forest conservation. Native people in different parts of the world have either at one extreme dispossessed of their land to make way for that forest conservation, or there's in some cases where indigenous people have received payments for their forest conservation and expand their land base. But literally those payments, the very same industries doing violence to people of color communities, to indigenous communities and other parts of the world. So how can we justify recovering our traditions in a bubble like that? It's distressing and something that's not really on enough people's radar. Even renewable energy, which I'm a strong advocate of, supply chains associated with renewable energy also involve renewable energy, also involve high carbon footprint activities. And so in this way, see strongly that indigenous people are exercising their rights, sovereignty by supporting renewable energy. But it has to be done in a way that's ethical, and we're not buying into a problematic type of resource economy. But I also think it's important just for folks, different tribes, like indigenous nations chose to be in this situation that's prone to dilemmas. And so it's important for folks to know that our leaders are making tough choices. We didn't choose to be in this situation. And so I believe that people have to have a fairly complex understanding of what's and just in the last few seconds, I just wanted to close with mentioning that with these solutions to climate change, there's also the problem that I think I see some kind of non-native people believe that if you create the renewables, then it'll solve the problem. But it'll solve the problem. But I think for tribes of our nations and communities are hoping for is to be leaders in the energy transition, to model a better energy. But we're not operating in a situation where reciprocity or sovereignty are in place. And so for any group or party that apply solutions to climate change quickly, we're not applying those onto like situation for many of indigenous people. They're applying them in situations where indigenous people are still struggling just to get basic respect for their consent, reciprocal economic relations, or fairness or non-exploitation. And so one of the big issues is whether some of the fast applied climate change solutions will just make more toxic situations which currently are not great for indigenous people. And we need to be prepared for that as a possibility.
Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of a lot of for some deeper reflection, and I'd like to pass the mic to Laura, especially because she is currently in Guyana, the lungs of Mother Earth, which is the Amazon, and really Amazon. You began speaking at the end of your previous question about what's happening with the mining concessions and your struggles lands and territories, and as we already know, as we already know, 85% biodiversity is found on indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And it is because of our lifeways. And it is because of that we have conserved and protected protected these goods in our homes because we are part of our home. So if you could reflect on that question, on climate change and indigenous peoples, and what are some ways that we can, and what are some ways that we move forward to integrate your human rights in this conversation.
Thank you, Anita. Yes. Thank you, Anita. I want to support. Kyle's presentation there and observations in terms of our way of life, our way of life, and how climate change impacted us. But also really how indigenous for us as in the Amazon, yes, as you're saying, as indigenous peoples, we have been contributing. We noticed contributing indisputable throughout the world. It's indisputable throughout the world. Way of life, indigenous people's way of life, connection with our lands and our connection with our lands and our resources that we apply is what is is what is our forest standing, our forest waters as healthy as we can, as healthy as we can. The state, as much as earlier, has been saying has been saying and doing giving out concessions even by way of what do we call it, lottery, really looking at lands as a commodity, has been really a setback in terms of Guyana staying. We are a forest, a heavily forested nation, and our policies, our legislation is contributing to our keeping our forest climate finance, and all of that really has not respected indigenous people's way of life, as being the reason why we have so much forest standing, why we have healthy systems, but being very much at risk, as I said, because there's so many mining concessions that covers Guyana's lands. And it is important that it recognizes and truly to what it says at a global level, in saying at a global level, in saying that forested nation and we keep our forest standing, and move beyond just looking at it as a commodity or looking for it to gain climate finance at the international level. It is wrong. It is misleading. And for indigenous peoples, in as much we would not want to put a price or turn our forests into commodities, or forests into commodities in climate change and climate discussions. It's still important that financing indigenous peoples directly, that they are able to apply their own ways of protecting our forests and holding governments accountable from a collective point is really important. And it's important for the world to the corporate and let's say the corporate world and states to ensure that our rights to lands, our resources are respected, and not to believe that just giving finances and we continue doing as any other day, and to gain profits is not going to save us. It's not going to save us. We have only one world. We have only one country. So when we speak as indigenous peoples, protect our lands, respect our rights to own and control. It's really not just for indigenous peoples, but it's for all of Guyana. But it's for all of Guyana. And as I said, discuss and dialogue at the international level with regards to climate change and combating global warming. Then let us apply here in Guyana and do the right thing and respect our rights respect our leadership on our right to be included in discussions at a national level, respect that Indigenous people's rights are collective and respect that Indigenous leaders are speaking collectively and making recommendations legislative reform and all of that. It's really the states that have to know from the other side, as we have been continuing protection of our lands and our resources, and our territories, you know.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'd like to open the space for Tim. I'd like to open the space for Tim.
I'm not sure that I have much more to offer. There were a few remarks that I didn't make earlier that are held over a bit, but I think that we need to find ways to implement these declarations, to begin putting these rights into effect, and that's going to be key. The fact that countries don't respect these rights. At least they don't respect all. Well, much of the time. Well, that is the problem. That is the problem. That's where we need to overcome, and that's where we have to keep up the pressure on countries to do it. Implement a plan of action in the OAS, for example, to implement the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in the United Nations. There's still leftover work. United Nations needs to take increase the rights of Indigenous governments to participate in the United Nations. That work was being done before the pandemic. That work needs to be carried out in order to put the declaration better effect. And I'm sure there are many, more things like that, others could point out. And if we share them, with each other to use what political power we have, get these things done, will make a real difference over time.
Thank you so much. We're actually close to our time together, so I'd just like to offer one more question of reflection for all of the panelists. Tim, you actually started responding some of it, so maybe I'll let you go first. What message would you give on the relationship they should have with Indigenous nations and people? Have about 3 minutes for some closing reflections.
Well, the human rights violations affecting Indigenous people, I believe, from what I see, are growing worse. They're growing more numerous in the last few years. For a time, things have been improving. That time, I believe, has gone by. Now, I'm speaking mostly of the Americas. I try to be aware of what's going on around the world. Is frankly bigger than I can really embrace by myself. I'm thinking of the Americas. We see terrible human rights violations in the Brazilian Amazon and elsewhere in Brazil and elsewhere in Nicaragua, Guatemala for that matter, Honduras. Countries are falling into lawlessness. They're falling dictatorships actually. They're turning away law from the rule of law, not just about Indigenous people, but about everyone. And when the rule of law fails, indigenous peoples are always hurt very bad. Countries of the world join together to do everything they can to whatever measures they can put a stop to this trend that is so alarming trend, harmful to indigenous people, harmful to everyone really. We've got to do more about the rights of indigenous people, and I think we can do more. In many ways, but one way that I wanted to mention, demonstrating that indigenous peoples are now a permanent world community. They're a permanent community. They're political communities in their own country.